Brazil has the largest population of people of African descent outside of Africa. They constitute about 56% of Brazil's 212.6 million total population. This makes Afro-Brazilians the largest group of black people, second only to Nigeria. Yet, black people make up just 18% of the Brazilian Congress. They also represent less than 5% of executives in Brazil's 500 biggest companies. They constitute 75% of murder victims and 75% of those killed by the police. In 2019, Jair Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil, who has apparently modeled himself after Donald Trump, proposed a so-called anti-crime bill that included a blanket self-defense justification for the use of force by the police. Are you still wondering why the Black Lives Matter movement and other anti-black racism movements should be up front and center global movements? Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please support us through Patreon and by buying me coffee so we can continue to bring you this series. Subscribe if you have not yet done so, and please turn on your notification buttons so you know when we have new episodes. And of course, share our videos with all your contacts. Now, Portugal's first interest in Brazil was to capture and monopolize the trade of pau-brasil, a kind of red wood which was used to make dye. The trade in pau-brasil was started by the Tupinamba Indians, one of the indigenous groups which populated South America. So the name Brazil, which was adopted for the country after Portuguese colonizers succeeded in their mission of colonizing the area, was derived from pau-brasil. Initially, the Indians actually tried to work with the Portuguese to harvest the trees. However, the Portuguese were after a bigger commercial venture and needed to keep looking for bigger forests to harvest, and this reduced the amount of profits they were making. They then started establishing plantations on cleared land, which meant they needed people to work on the plantations which they built on the cleared lands. So the Portuguese at first tried unsuccessfully to enslave the indigenous people. They failed because the Indians, who were actually not used to working the kind of long hours under inhuman conditions that the Portuguese were forcing on them, were also dying in droves because of the diseases that the Portuguese brought with them. Many of these indigenous people either fled inland or died. The Portuguese then started importing African slaves to work for them because they had virtually depleted the indigenous population that they met there. As a matter of fact, at the time of the arrival of Pedro Alvares Cabral, who got to the area now known as Brazil in April 1500, the indigenous population was more than 3 million. Cabral is believed to be the first Portuguese to arrive there. Currently, there are only about 200,000 of them left. Now, most accounts record that between 4 million and 4.9 million people from Africa were forcibly transported to Brazil during the period from 1501 to 1866. However, Let's pause to briefly try and imagine what this number represents in terms of lives lost and the violence suffered. First, only a fraction of those captured actually survived the journey to Brazil. Around 40% of the captives died between the areas inland of Africa where they were captured and the African coast, because they had to travel for days, weeks, months under inhuman conditions, hardly fed and watered, shackled. A lot of them actually died before they got to the coast. Now, another 15% died in the ships during the crossings from Africa to Brazil. When they got to Brazil, another 10 to 12% of the slaves died in the places where they were kept to be bought by their future masters. And when they finally got to the plantations, mines, or other places where they were forced to work, they suffered various types of extreme violence and sadism at the hands of the white men and women who enslaved them. African women were particularly targeted by white women due to jealousy or to prevent a relationship between their husbands and the female slaves. So, what was the origin of the black people in Brazil? The Africans taken to Brazil belonged to two major groups. The Bantu people from West Africa, who were mostly from ethnic groups now known as Yoruba, formed a large percentage. Please, if you have not watched our episode on Ife, do so. Because as I illustrated there, the name Yoruba is a recent phenomenon. Ethnic groups which now identify collectively as Yoruba worldwide were known only by the names of their kingdoms. As such, they were Ijebu, Ijesha, Oyo, Ife, Egba, and so on. By the time the people captured from these areas got to Brazil, because the various dialects of the Yoruba language which they spoke were mutually intelligible to the various groups, they became known collectively as Nago. The word Nago derives from Anago, the name used to describe the language spoken by one of the Bantu groups captured from West Africa. Other Bantu people were mostly brought from present-day Angola and the Congo, most belonging to the Bakongo and Ambundu ethnic groups. Bantu people were also captured from the Shona kingdoms of Zimbabwe, of present-day Zimbabwe, and the coastal Mozambique. They were taken in large numbers to Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais, and northeastern Brazil. Now, some of the people who were captured were already Islamized and spoke Arabic. Many of them could read and write in Arabic, in their Arabic language. Many of these enslaved African Muslims were way better educated than their Portuguese Brazilian masters, who could not read or write the Portuguese language. Some of these enslaved people ended up in Bahia. These Muslim slaves were known as Malay in Brazil. They were responsible for one of the most powerful slave revolts in the Americas, known as the Malay Revolt of 1835. By the time of the 1835 uprising, the population of Brazil was mostly made up of people of African origin. But whether free or not, whether free or enslaved, it did not matter, because they were seen and treated as the lowest rung of society. The Malay Revolt tried to take control of Salvador, which at the time was the largest city on the American continent and the entire New World. Now, the Malay Uprising was significant in many ways. It took place during the last 10 days of Ramadan, the holy month, in January of 1835. The freedom fighters wore identifiable attires, including head coverings and long white tunics, and carried prayer beads as well as Quranic amulets on their bodies for protection. The revolt was organized by the Nago and Hausa Muslims, but non-Muslim Africans from various backgrounds joined them. They targeted white people and any others who they identified as part of or supporters of the slaveholding society. There had been several other uprisings over a period of about 30 years, 3 decades. But the 1835 event was the largest. As a result of the 1835 revolt, more than 500 Muslim Africans were expelled from Brazil and returned to African countries. Many suspects were deported with no evidence of their participation in the uprising. Now, for those who are familiar with the history of the city of Lagos in Nigeria, some of the Malay who returned to Africa ended up in the area that then became known as the Brazilian quarters in Lagos. In Nigeria, they were called Imale. Also, starting around the 1830s, many freed Africans chose to voluntarily return to Africa from Brazil, and most settled in the coastal city of Lagos alongside the Saros. The word Saro is a corruption of Sierra Leone. Saros who settled in Lagos were either returnees from Freetown in Sierra Leone, and returnees were people who had either settled in Freetown from places like Nova Scotia. They had returned from Nova Scotia in Canada and other parts of North America. Now, recaptives were people who had been saved from being transported to the Americas for enslavement. They were rescued from slave ships before the ships could leave Africa. Now, like the free Africans from Brazil, most also settled in Lagos, although some others found their ways to places like Abeokuta and other parts of Nigeria, other parts of the country now known as Nigeria. Now, other returnees from Brazil, who were mostly Catholic by faith, were known as Amaru or Agudas when they settled in Lagos. These various groups of African returnees have left their marks on the architecture and cultural life of Lagos and Nigeria in some enduring ways, since most were skilled artisans and educated. They started the earliest nationalist struggles for Nigeria's independence. Although the Malay Uprising did not succeed in overtaking Bahia from the Portuguese, it scared the living daylight out of the colonialists. And it was a major factor in bringing about an end to the legal importation of slaves from Africa in 1850 and the eventual abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888. Now, racism in Brazil is quite complex. For example, Brazil was the last place in the Americas to abolish slavery, like I said, in 1888. And by the 1900s, the white people in that country started promoting what they described as racial democracy. On paper, this idea of racial democracy sounded harmless in that it encouraged the mixing of indigenous, white Europeans, and Black African cultures. However, in reality, it was simply a way to whiten the country because miscegenation or racial mixing had been going on in Brazil even during slavery. There was therefore a high rate of sexual interactions among the colonial masters who were predominantly male and African women because there were very few white females. Also, some studies show that male colonists, white male colonists, even preferred to mate with their African slaves because of the level of control that they had over them since they owned them. As such, by the time of independence, unlike in North America, the Brazilian population was highly mixed. However, even as the idea of racial democracy was being promoted, the reason why politicians, the media at the time, and academics were encouraging the descendants of enslaved Africans and indigenous communities to marry and have children with the descendants of white colonizers, as well as the European migrants that had now started flocking in. The reason was that increasingly lighter skinned generations could be produced and the country could become whitened. With the whitening also came the valorization of everything European and the denigration of indigenous and Black African cultures. It has also encouraged a persistent denial of racial discrimination and conflict, and all of these have affected the Afro-Brazilians today. So, despite their sizable demographic, Afro-Brazilians still face major disadvantages and institutionalized discrimination. They face severe inequalities in every area of their lives, from health and education to employment and wealth and so on. All these are tied to the fact that politically, Black people remain heavily underrepresented. Sadly, racial tensions in Brazil have continued to be inflamed by the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who during his campaign for office in 2018 compared Black people to cattle and got away with it. Thankfully, generations of Brazilians of African descent have resisted oppression by drawing strength from their cultural heritage and religions which they have preserved and which have influenced many aspects of Brazilian life. For instance, they have left their marks on the Brazilian Portuguese language, which has been richly influenced by African Brazilian vocabulary. Afro-Brazilian religions also constitute a powerful source of strength, which enables believers to reaffirm their African identity. An example is candomblé, that developed in Brazil through a process of syncretism between several of the traditional religions of West Africa, especially that of the Yoruba and the Roman Catholic form of Christianity. Candomblé involves the veneration of various orishas like Oya, Oshun, Ogun, Yemoja, and so many others. Candomblé traditions are central to the lives of many Afro-Brazilians. Religious leaders conduct their ceremonies in the Yoruba language, and candomblé rituals have been incorporated into the Brazilian national identity. Examples are the New Year's Eve offerings to the ocean, the capoeira dance, samba circles, and the food culture such as acarajé, which is similar to akarajesha, a popular delicacy among the Yoruba of Western Nigeria. Umbanda is another example of a syncretic religion that blends African traditions with Roman Catholicism, Spiritism, and indigenous American beliefs. It is therefore not surprising that as racial discrimination has continued to escalate, Afro-Brazilians are drawing on this wealth of culture to fight injustice. For example, they are turning to the idea of the quilombos as platforms to fight racism in Brazil. Now, the concept of quilombo as a phenomenon links Black Brazilian communities and the cultural and political traditions of several African countries. During slavery itself, when some of the enslaved Africans brought to Brazil managed to escape from plantations, they formed settlements in rural areas. They called their communities, which grew vibrant outside of white society, quilombos. Now, the word is believed to have come from one of the Bantu languages which they brought with them from Africa. And according to Stephanie Souto, who is a cultural researcher, Quiombo means war camp. She further explains that the word has many meanings, but basically it's a social practice and can refer to both the warriors themselves and the territories where they meet. The idea of the Quiombo was actually broadened by Beatriz Nascimento, an academic and influential figure in Brazil's 20th century Black rights movement. She drew attention to how the concept of quilombos could serve the wider cause of anti-racism in Brazil. Nascimento proposed that quilombos need not be fixed places of resistance and refuge, as it had been for enslaved Africans who built physical communities, but that it could be an approach to many disciplines such as literature, history, and political movements. Thanks for watching. Please support us through Patreon and by buying me coffee so we can continue to bring you this series. Subscribe if you have not, and please turn on your notification buttons. Don't forget to share our videos with all your contacts. And of course, keep those comments coming. Thank you.